Thomas, if you want to go ahead again, but also Eugene, if you want to start recording.
Okay, cool. Hello again. Thanks again. Good to see everyone here. I'm just going to talk really briefly about disaster capitalism, which is something me and Eugene talked about in our little strike syllabus thing we did earlier this week. Thinking about sort of where it comes from and how it's situating our moment right now amidst COVID stuff. So the term disaster capitalism was kind of coined by activist and journalist Naomi Klein in her 2007 book Shock Doctrine. She defined disaster capitalism as orchestrated raids on the public sphere in the wake of catastrophic events, combined with the treatment of disasters as exciting market opportunities. And this is a kind of approach to disaster and crises that has played out throughout the 20th century, 21st century. And it was kind of ideologically born in the Chicago School of Economics in the 1960s under free market capitalist Nelson Friedman, who thought that these kinds of crises or shocks were the only ways we could get rid of dilutions to the market, such as government intervention, and implement pure capitalism. So the kind of testing ground for that was, not surprisingly, the third world, specifically South American countries, where coups were orchestrated with the help of the government, ironically the US government, CIA, to implement neoliberal policies. And since then, disaster capitalist policies have sort of expanded as far as how we can understand that as moments in which crisis is used as a cover to push through neoliberal, corporate, and fossil fuel interests and conservative political agendas. And of course, war is tied into that, specifically with fossil fuel, but these are the kind of some of the big constellations of ideas around disaster capitalism. Since the interventions in the third world and parts of Europe in the 20th century, we have seen disaster capitalist policies being implemented in the US, unsurprisingly, in crises that disproportionately impact Black and brown folks in communities, such as Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, have been two big moments through which disaster capitalist privatization projects and like contracting of black water has been very popular. And we see obviously at work now, if we were thinking about the way the government's been responding to COVID-19 crises, the cutting back of EPA regulations is just like kind of a big one that we maybe draws a lot of attention. And that's a product that Trump administration had been involved with before coronavirus, but the coronavirus gave a new impetus to even further deregulation. And on sort of not quite a capitalism, neoliberalism front, but just political front, we see restrictions against women's access to abortion as being non-essential, and anti-trans bills in states like Idaho that are all being passed in this kind of time of chaos. And so I just want to end quickly by talking about some of the ways that disaster capitalism is like baked into our current administration. First of all, Vice President Pence oversaw the Republican Study Committee, which implemented privatization schemes in Katrina after they're in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And one of the first things on that list of items the committee came up with was to get rid of wage protections for contract workers who were going to be rebuilding infrastructure. And Steve Mnuchin, who's currently overseeing, he's the Treasury Secretary, who's overseeing our stimulus money, is the foreclosure king of the US in the aftermath of the 2008 market crash. He bought a bank and enriched himself like $200 million through foreclosing almost 40,000 people. That's it for me.
Thanks, Thomas. I'm Eugene, I use he, him pronouns. For my part of this, I think Thomas gives a great overview of what disaster capitalism means. And for me, the idea of disaster capitalism, that it is a crisis that no one could anticipate and we have no idea what we're doing, is a myth in the sense that it is used, these moments of crisis are used to re-entrench power and are actually the result of choices. So the current health crisis that we find ourselves in is about priorities in the moral and public sphere. So right after the 2008 financial crisis, we see 50,000 positions have been eliminated from public health departments nationwide. So it's not that suddenly we have no recourse left. It's that these are choices, and these choices get us from places of austerity politics, so cutting benefits to healthcare and education to the working class in order to benefit those at the topmost positions of power, the financialization of the economy, which caused the 2008 collapse. It is a concentration of power in the hands of the few. It is the defunding and indifference toward common goods, so thinking about common resources and the environment, healthcare, education, just support services for people in general, and also that the whole discussion of the virus gets wrapped in language of militarization and social and racial cleansing. So these ideas of crisis get wrapped up in how we think about it, and our ways forward become about a battle, become about a fight. And the discourse is continually about the economy, but right, not the economy of the working class people. It is the economy of stockholders and the global financial order. So as we get forward into other people talking, I think we wanted to give this background of where we're at and where we're heading, because while COVID is new, the things that are happening are not new, and in fact come back time and time again to re-entrench us into this capitalist politics of defunding the working class and re-entrenching power into elites. So I appreciate your time. Check out Strike Syllabus every Monday at 2, and I can't wait to hear from other people.
Awesome, thank you both. Let's go to Julia Fine next.
All right, can everyone? Yes? Okay. I'll go ahead and share my screen. I have some slides to show you. So, not this one. I'm part of a research group made up mainly of students, undergraduate and graduate at UCSB, and we're interested in researching climate justice through linguistics and sociology. And we saw this call for papers from this new journal, the Journal of Environmental Media, and we want to do a study of discourses about COVID-19 and climate justice that has some kind of real-world application, and that we can use also as a means of outreach or movement building. So I'm just going to give you a whirlwind tour of all of the discourses that I've noticed about the pandemic and climate justice. I follow a bunch of different hashtags and like climate justice accounts. So I've been kind of inundated with these lately. So just to tease apart what's happening so far, maybe you've seen this. I've been seeing a lot of like angry Mother Nature type metaphor. So for instance, this post says, kind of feels like Mother Nature just sent us all to our rooms to think about what we've done. And there's a lot of other posts along these lines too. And then another theme that I've noticed is observations of lowered pollution and of animals returning to the environment. Some of these though are a little bit shady or questionable. So like, yeah, it's true that there's noticeably, measurably less pollution in many cities, but then people are posting stuff like, oh, look at all these swans and dolphins in the canals of Venice, and that just does not check out. This is actually the nearby city of Burano. So some of this is misinformation. And then there's the ubiquitous, we are the virus discourses, which I'm sure we've all seen. So for instance, this person is tweeting, our Earth is too damaged and had enough tolerating human behavior. We've been sadly taking it for granted. The way I see it, this pandemic is just a Mother Nature's self-healing process. We are the virus. So again, another Mother Nature metaphor, and then this catchphrase, we are the virus. And I've heard reports that some of these discourses are actually being produced by right-wing or conservative groups, which is interesting, but I need to check to make sure that's actually true. Okay. So there's also been a rise of satirical reinterpretations of this nature is healing, we are the virus discourse, like this giant rubber duck returning to the Thames, pizza returning to the trees of Italy, and Lisa Frank dolphins returning to the Hudson River, etc. So this is satirizing that. And then there's also discourses that say, hey, this is woke eugenics or eco-fascism, to say that we are all the virus. And there's instead been some counter discourses that arose, like humans are not a virus, the system is a virus, drawn from Extinction Rebellion. And also capitalism is the virus is another catchphrase that I've seen a lot. there's also been a lot of comparisons of the severity of the pandemic to the climate crisis. So for instance, this shows a human being followed by COVID-19, which is in turn being followed by a larger shark, the upcoming economic crisis, and then that's being followed by the shark that is climate change. So saying that climate change is much more severe. And there's also comparisons of the ways that we've responded, oftentimes with people expressing frustration that we're not taking climate change as seriously as the pandemic and not shutting everything down. There's also discourses I've seen that frame the pandemic as practice for the climate crisis, again with a Mother Nature metaphor. Here's a virus, practice. Another thing that people have pointed out is that these two challenges are actually intertwined because ecosystem collapse may have led to different patterns of animal migration, which in turn can cause pandemics. And then I think maybe one of the most promising or helpful discourses is advocating for similar responses to both crises through a just recovery and a just transition. So things like emphasizing people's health and workers' rights, and creating community resilience and trusting science. Yeah. And then finally, I think Ana Rosa is going to speak more about this, but there's discourses that talk about essential workers as hostages rather than heroes, pointing out that they really have no choice but to go do these jobs, and they don't get a lot of say in whether or not they're even protected while on the job. Finally, there's a lot of highlighting of different types of emotions in various organizations. So like the Sunrise Movement has embraced this discourse of militant optimism. And then within Extinction Rebellion, I've seen the phrase love and rage circulating. So it's kind of like each movement seems to have sort of its own emotional aesthetic. So finally, I want to open this up to everyone and we can continue this discussion later. But I'm just curious, what ways of conceptualizing the two crises have you found to be helpful, inspiring, empowering, etc.? Which ones have you found to be unhelpful or even harmful to the movement over time? And also what kinds of ideas you might have for how to apply this research, maybe do some kind of outreach piece or opinion piece or something like that. And finally, there's a link to a Google Doc, which I can drop in the chat too, where we can collaborate on these things. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julia. We'll definitely circle back to those questions later on. Thank you for that. So let's go on and move to Jess.
Hi, everyone. I'm just really grateful for what Julia, Thomas, and Eugene shared before me. And just to kind of connect what I'm going to be talking about, I'm just a reflection on the future of work. At how we're thinking about labor in this moment. A lot of us are experiencing a different kind of interface right now. We're on Zoom doing this kind of work. I think what's really important about the COVID-19 pandemic is that it provides a moment of exposure. And I think the 2008-2009 financial crisis also provided a moment of exposure of the ways in which our economic system is predicated upon a value framework that makes absolutely no sense. So we have, for example, workers that have been deemed essential, but they're also still disposable. And there's been a lot of conflict with different employers and corporations not providing hazard pay, for example, for those that are being asked to be on the front lines, grocery workers, folks working in food processing plants coming down with COVID-19. I think it's an important thing to reflect on. And I basically want to plug the ILO's, International Labor Organization's work on the future of work. So they have some really amazing reports and resources. And I'll go ahead and share the screen and pull that up. But I think what's important, we're asked, like, how are we going to make sense out of all of this overwhelming complexity? So the meme mapping that Julia was kind of mentioning, I think is extremely critical right now so that we can get really clear about our values moving forward. And the ILO has put forward a call for an agenda that's human-centered. So we're gonna see these trends, these market trends towards automation. There's a lot of work that's been deemed essential now that could very well, because of these market trends, be eliminated. It could be replaced with robots, AI, all kinds of things. So this call for a more human-centered agenda in the future of work, I think, is really important. But I think as we're talking about these compounding crises, the pandemic, climate, how can we move that even further and move towards an eco framework, perhaps, this larger kind of systems, big picture framework, especially coming off of the heels of Earth Day. Let me see if I can get that up. Share screen. There we go. Sure. Okay, can everyone see that? Cool. So connecting to global projects right now, where folks are coming up with really wonderful ideas and alternatives to this corporate serving economy towards an economy that actually serves people on the planet. And there's some really great work that I think we need to figure out how to harness our networks. Essentially is my point. And again, I'm more interested in the dialogue and the folks coming after me, but that's just what I want to put forward is how do we connect our strategies and generate coherence in a time where folks are feeling inundated? This complexity is really hard to navigate. And so this rise in like fake news and all of that, I think kind of speaks to that overwhelm that folks are feeling and wanting to find meaning or find politically convenient opportunities to further their own agendas. So I think that's really important. And I think what's really interesting as well, the ILO has a report showing that while we may be prioritizing environmentally focused goals or sustainable goals, how do we make sure that we're also furthering decent work at the same time? So not having it be, you're either being sustainable or either protecting labor rights and the rights of workers. So how do we do the same thing? How do we do them both at the same time and do them really well? So that's just the thought I want to leave with everyone. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jess. So now let's go to Rai.
So, hey everyone. So I'm gonna do my presentation just with my picture there because I'm not super confident in my internet connection. If you do have a problem with my internet connection and I'm laggy, let me know. I'll be monitoring the chat. So thanks, guys. Well, comrades, it's spring 2020. 51 days ago, California declared a state of emergency due to COVID-19. Coronavirus hit this country like a ton of bricks, exposing every vulnerability and precarity of our system, our healthcare system, the most costly care of the worst quality that goes to the fewest people along the most dire fissures of inequality for the most amount of money of anywhere in the industrialized world. Our political system, a confused tangle of noodly incompetence rife with bureaucratic dick-stepping on a good day, a seething ball of malice shot through with incestuous opportunism on a bad day. Our economic system, where to begin? Who knew it might someday have been a bad idea to structure your economy so that only people with great jobs have sick days, health insurance, and savings? Provide no structure of work sharing of essential tasks, and dangle a gigantic portion of that economy on the fragile hope that maybe someone feels like having a drink today. Ladies and gentlemen, non-binary folks, and comrades of all stripes, the countdown to revolt declared on May Day of last year by Bonfire Collective, Student Activist Network, SPDSA, YDSA, ASME, Youth Like Sunrise, SJP, and Clementine's Collective is up, and it's time to ring in the new year. You guys start your calendars on May Day too, right? We become very well acquainted with the new kinds of precarity we're facing right now, each of us in different and painful ways. The particular kind of struggle I'd like to focus on today is the challenge that the COVID crisis poses to our organizing. From an organizing perspective, the necessity of social isolation has not only challenged our communal bonds, but it has rendered impossible many of our most beloved organizing tactics. Gathering in huge meetings that last for hours, shouting at cops, be careful, they all have COVID now. Publicly displaying messages written on cardboard, and holding decadent festivals where we watch adorable children destroy effigies of the president. As someone whose primary work for the past few months has been holding the picket line in front of Stork, hosting workshops and book-selling cafes at Merton House, and interrupting Raytheon recruitment sessions, COVID has forced me to adapt my organizing to meet the new crisis. So the problem presents itself. We have tremendous demand for more organizing to do more things, but a lot of our existing organizing tactics are not possible right now. To address this problem, I want to talk about the form of organizing that I spend most of my time engaged in, affinity groups. By affinity group organizing, I mean getting together with a small handful of people you love and with whom you share a common vision of the future, setting up good horizontal consensus decision-making procedures, and starting to look for local projects that excite you. Affinity group organizing has enormous potential to do immediate good in your local context. And since the beginning of the crisis, the affinity groups that I am part of have been able to do a tremendous amount of work on short notice. Through Bonfire Collective and the Coronavirus Task Force that formed with members of Bonfire and Student Activist Network, the last 2 months, we've been able to set up a website with Santa Barbara specific COVID resources, distribute flyers in Santa Barbara, Goleta, and IV on sanitation and social distancing procedures before the city declared a state of emergency, distribute flyers sharing the ICE Rapid Response Hotline and providing scripts for ICE raids, make dozens of masks and distribute them to houseless folks in Isla Vista, link up with Food Not Bombs and assist them with supplies and food distribution while some of the other members were away or under quarantine, keep the pressure on city council members mandating a rent payback structure to make sure people don't get evicted as soon as the moratorium is lifted, begin lobbying city council to create a municipal specific direct aid fund, help win porta potties stocked with hand sanitizer and tampons for houseless folks downtown. This is the first 24-hour bathrooms in years. Use connections with the County Board of Supervisors to get information on eviction courts and jail population reductions, and help network the Isla Vista Housing Crisis Group with county staff, link up with other prison solidarity organizers locally and across the state to plan actions around the prison in Lompoc. For all this, affinity group organizing tends to get sidelined. We often overemphasize the efficacy of large-scale organizing, like national campaigns, where we put a lot of eggs in one basket. Big tent organizing that subsumes rather than acknowledges differences of affinity and quickly fragments. And spectacular organizing that is often best characterized as risky awareness raising. Affinity group organizing should not be our only tactic. But let's talk about why it's so important now by looking at some of the factors we're all dealing with in times of crisis and COVID crisis. First, everything is happening over Zoom. Being on a Zoom call with more than 15 people is insanely difficult. Social distancing has made large-scale organizing practically impossible. But small group organizing, such as in affinity groups, is still entirely on the table. For folks with certain disabilities, the shift towards Zoom actually makes affinity group organizing even more accessible than before. Second, you miss your friends. Affinity group organizing means that you have new cause to come together productively with your friends and do something positive for yourselves and your communities. Much more than Netflix party, mutual aid conversations about mask distribution gives you purpose to connect. Third, a lot of people have a little more time on their hands than usual, and they're looking to organize. If you're new to organizing, it can be challenging to know where to begin. It's often hard for people to join big organizations. They can be intimidating, and a lot of them aren't run very well. And it often seems like all the big decisions are being made somewhere else. Starting with an affinity group means you start with people you trust already, who you wanted to see anyway, and who respect your ideas. Affinity groups are essential not just because it's what we can do now. The love and respect they are built on is the foundation of effective, emotionally sustainable organizing at every level. Fourth, much of the COVID work that needs to be done is hyper-local and requires a ton of local knowledge. We need mutual aid grocery and mask projects, houseless aid, and information distribution about ICE raids. When it comes to these tasks, a dozen small affinity groups organizing in their neighborhoods they know like the back of their hands can be much more effective than federal, state, or even county groups. Further, the utter failure of centralized management in this crisis should wake us up to the truth that resilience is a local quality of systems and that we cannot be resilient if we are relying on outside decision makers. People are rightly upset about Bernie dropping out, but the truth is, even with a progressive president, we would need to be building up local resilience anyway. Finally, organizing in long-term sustainable affinity groups means that you will be poised to address new crises as they emerge. Bonfire Collective started during Occupy, and when Trump got elected, we were already on the ground meeting and could assist in holding workshops and in helping new activists find groups and causes they cared about. When COVID hit, we were able to quickly pivot to mask making and COVID propaganda, and Student Activist Network had a lot of political ties to pull on. Now, let's talk about how to build your affinity group. Start with a small group of people you care deeply about, your friends. Literally, just find 3 other people who want to get involved and set up a Zoom date to talk about what you might be able to do together. The key to affinity groups is, you guessed it, affinity. So let's get more technical about that. Having affinity with someone means you share a common vision of the future. You want the same kind of world. It is tiresome to organize with people who you don't share a common vision of the future with. While I don't think affinity alignment is necessary when working in coalitions, in my core group, I don't want to constantly be having debates about the merits of decentralized autonomous worker cooperatives versus central planning. So make sure you all agree on the basics. What the basics are will differ from group to group, and it often varies by your depth of political socialization. I recommend, for a fun activity, for everyone to take some kind of which kind of leftist are you quiz, and then talk casually about your results. There will be some varieties in your answers, and that's fine, but it's probably good to make sure you're more or less on the same page. It's also important to think about identity. Identity informs how we see the world, our experience of it, our knowledge. Acknowledging identity will help your group appreciate each other's expertise. And while I don't recommend that people organize affinity groups based solely on identity, or that they exclude members based on their identity, groups formed around identity can be hugely effective in undertaking issue-specific campaigns like disability activism. Finally, a discussion about tactics is essential. These kinds of discussions will help you figure out what you want to do with your affinity group. Are people in your group really committed to mutual aid tactics? Are they really dedicated to tactics of art and propaganda creation? As you start to think about what you love and what you're good at, you'll discover that a lot of the things that you do, that you love to do, crafting, writing, cooking, gardening, can be politicized. More to the point on your conversation about tactics, how do people feel about risky actions? How do people feel about community self-defense? Having these conversations early on will prevent serious miscommunications down the road. I want to thank everyone for your time today. In the chat, I'm including a drive link with notes to this presentation, as well as 3 zines that can help you think about affinity, identity, and tactics, and will help you get some good consensus decision-making practice in your group. Get out there and start the revolt.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rai. The how-to was very specific, and I think that was great for you to share. Let's go to Ana Rosa.
Hi, everyone. This week, a lot of us were involved in Earth Day planning. So in that spirit, just a reminder that those of us who are on the Central Coast, acknowledging that this land is Chumash land, and we thank them for the ability to be here together. So I was on a talk or a webinar with Arundhati Roy yesterday morning, where she talked about this pandemic providing a portal to step through. And unfortunately, there are capitalists who are very ready to use this portal as a way to increase the aggressiveness of capitalism and getting bailouts for corporations, while those of us who believe in people power can step through this portal by building a new normal, right? So taking reins of the language that we're even using, like social distancing, that's actually not what this is. It's physical distancing, but there's no reason why it has to be social distancing, right? Because there are ways that we can be in touch with each other and organize with each other that brings us even closer together, even though it may not be in a physical space. So making sure that we don't go back to normal, right? Because what was normal? There was nothing normal about classism. Racism is not normal. Homophobia is not normal. Transphobia is not normal. Ableism is not normal. Ageism is not normal. Climate change is not normal. So we need to build a new normal together based on solidarity. So at the same time as we are uplifting workers as superheroes, which absolutely I think that they are, we need to make sure that we are also making sure that essential workers have what they need in order to be able to continue to do their jobs in a way that is safe and dignified, right? So I'm sure that Rachel will be talking about that more in her talk of what exactly it is that we can do, because I don't want to take away any talking points. But as environmentalists, let's make sure that we are doing everything we can to provide that solidarity. So when we're talking about the Green New Deal, right, making sure that we're talking about a fair and just transition, centering workers in that conversation, right? So there have been 4 Green New Deal House meetings that Food and Water Action has hosted in person. And now that we're in this COVID-19 reality, we're switching over to doing them virtually. So if you would like to commit to hosting a virtual House meeting on what a Central Coast real grassroots Green New Deal could look like, let me know and I can send you a toolkit. So, you know, around mutual aid, personal protective equipment is definitely key for all workers to have, and making sure people who are providing food for others are able to access food themselves, right? Because we know for many years, farm workers who actually enable all of us to have our sustenance often cannot have enough money to put food on the table, right? So let's remember always the workers when we are engaging in our mutual aid activism. I know La Casa de la Raza has just started a food distribution. And if you would like to get in touch with Sage, who is on this Zoom, about plugging in with that, I know Sage has several volunteers lined up who want to help. And in this talk of workers, let's not forget other people who are seen as disposable, people in prisons, right? There was just a terrible situation where at Lompoc Federal Prison, there was a man, a Black man named Ephraim Stetson, and he was diagnosed with COVID-19 and was not even treated before being released. They put him on a Greyhound to die and potentially infect loved ones, right? So we have to provide solidarity for people because we are all people, we are human beings, we are part of one family. So let's not forget anybody who has been seen as disposable, because this crisis is actually showing us that those who are most seen as disposable are the most essential for our communities. So with that, I'll send it over to Rachel to talk more about that.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So my name is Rachel Torres. I work with United Food and Commercial Workers, Local 770. So we represent grocery, cannabis, drug retail, meatpacking workers throughout the Central Coast and Los Angeles. So in fact, all the industries that we represent have been deemed essential, which is extraordinary on one level. It's finally sort of highlighted the work of thousands of workers who, you know, for many years were sort of treated as, you know, insignificant, unnoticed, unrecognized. So we truly appreciate the work that's been done in the community, in the press, among our electeds to sort of recognize that. The flip of it, I think, is what Ana Rosa and others have talked about in terms of what that actually means. To be essential means that they don't have the privilege of sheltering at home during this time, that they're called in to serve as frontline workers every day, to be most vulnerable to the pandemic, and to work at very low wages. You know, this, if folks have been following the hero pay, you know, which we find, well, I'll speak personally, find incredibly condescending and insulting when it's only a $2 raise. Folks would be making more money on unemployment than they do working during this crisis. And we're talking about unionized workers. The situation for ununionized workers is detrimentally worse. But we've been proud to be able to pass policy at the local level, at the county level, and at the state level to protect both union and non-union. So there's deep solidarity that's been occurring. We're very proud of that. But it's been a fight. It's been a fight from day one. When we went in 6 weeks ago asking for PPE, for hand washing, for crowd control, for social distancing, this was in LA City. We were told by the city attorney's office, you can't do that. That violates all these laws to push for that. And we said, how can that be? How can you be pushing back on the most simple, essential ways to protect workers, to protect community, to flatten the curve? So we had to push back hard, and we did all the things we thought we needed to do in terms of mobilization, letter writing campaigns, phone calls, contacting every ally we could. And eventually we got a executive order from the mayor of Los Angeles. And from there, that set a path forward for LA County and the health department there, for Ventura County to adopt similar measures. Surprisingly, Santa Barbara County has some of the most lax policy when it comes to essential workers. Typically speaking, Santa Barbara leads on issues like this, but unfortunately, there has been a lot of rhetoric that has sort of produced this overall notion that that we're way ahead of the curve and therefore we don't need to strengthen it. But as we know, based on previous pandemics, that as soon as you start loosening things and people start returning as if everything's fine, you see an uptick in the pandemic. So we really, really want to avoid that. Some folks have asked us, what are some of the things that we can do to support? Obviously advocating, I think as folks mentioned, at the local level is incredibly important. To take photos when you go inside of the store and observe what you see. Do folks have PPE? Are customers wearing face coverings? Is social distancing being respected? Is crowd control being enforced? If these things are not happening, then we have the utmost duty to report this to the county health department and ensure that inspections are occurring and that stricter regulation is occurring. The response that's happened in LA County has been extraordinary, where if you go into a store, you're held, you have to wait in line. When you go in, you see markings on the ground. All of these things make a huge difference in the lives of grocery workers. So it's a really tiny, tiny role that we in the community can play. But if we respect these policies, even if we're not being asked to, even if that's not the rule of thumb for the store, that you come in with a mask, that you respect space, that you limit the time that you're in the store and you limit the amount of trips that you take, all of these things are making a difference, and they are giving workers the protections that they need. So very small, but valuable. And I'll just add a sort of a count note is that when we started this, as folks talked about disaster capitalism, we had this vision of sort of disaster socialism, in terms of all the things we wanted to get, that we wanted to push really hard for. And it's been a struggle. I mean, not shocking among this panel. But it's been incredible, the level of pushback. Things that we thought were very, very basic, nothing but pushback. 2 weeks later, it becomes the norm. We said we want face covering, no face covering. 3 weeks later, everybody's in face covering. So just to say that, this is going to be nothing but a fight. The corporations want to own the entire thing and say that they were the ones that came up with this stuff. They have fought us the whole entire way. They do not like when their workers are enforcing the health code. They use the threat of retaliation against them, even though that's in the policy. So, if you hear or see things in the store and wonder why isn't that going on, or why aren't things happening the way we're told, it's because the corporations do not want to create panic. They do not want to slow down business. They are making record profits. Kroger, which owns the Ralph's company, made the highest profits in March that they've ever made. So, you know, I think we've talked about sort of winners and losers during this time period. But I don't want to say it's all been dark. One of the proudest things that we've accomplished over this time period is the governor's health directive providing 2 weeks of paid sick leave for the entire food chain. So from farm workers to grocery workers to food delivery drivers. And that's because it was a statewide push. And how did we do it? As folks mentioned, this level of organizing is so different. How did we do it? We did it through letter writing. We did it through a petition in which we gathered over 30,000 signatures. We did it through phone calls. We did it through all of the things that we as progressives know how to do. The governor listened and made sure that this happened. And also Cal OSHA came up with this very strict list of priorities for workers to follow through on. So just to say that, you know, the future is not bleak, that movements are working during this time, that we still have power to create real change. And we hope and expect that, you know, if and when this emergency order is lifted, that workers will say, wait a sec, I had 2 weeks of paid sick days. I'm not ready to give that up again. And that the standards that we set during this time period can be followed through and carried through way beyond. And that's our plan, and that's our hope for the future.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. So that ends the panel portion. And so now let's do Q&A. So if you have questions for our panelists, please put yourself on stack. And so just say stack in the chat box, and you can ask your questions to the panelists. And we'll do that for about until 11.
I'm so amazed that we're right on schedule.
Can I just ask for folks, especially folks in Santa Barbara County and city, what has been the experience inside of, if you have any to share, of in the grocery stores? Have you noticed high crowds? Have you noticed good regulation? Have you noticed folks being able to wash their hands? What has been sort of the on the ground experience?
I live here in Isla Vista, and I just want to recognize our food co-op here. They've done an amazing job of just reminding folks that we need to protect those that are on the front lines in the grocery stores. I think folks have, from my experience, have been somewhat respectful, but we have a really badass general manager, and she's there like making announcements, reminding folks. So that's been a really great experience, a good model.
Thanks for that, Jess. Also, I was going to bring up the co-op and the great job they're doing as well. One thing that's been particularly that particularly struck me when I went to the co-op last time is they have plastic screens that are set up to distance the workers from people coming through the line, which I was just really impressed with. And I think that's just a great idea. I noticed that a lot of the customers, I think probably because they're like young and think they're invincible and think that everyone else is invincible, they are not usually wearing face masks. And at least last time that I went to the co-op, it was not a requirement that you wear a face mask upon going in, as it is a requirement in other places around town like Lazy Acres. So that's something to perhaps think about.
I can say, hi, I'm Sage. Sorry, I don't have my video on. It's just one of those days. But yeah, I can say that the plexiglass is up in Trader Joe's as well, and the post office I went to the other day, so in between customers and staff. And one of the things I've appreciated about Trader Joe's is that they're limiting the number of people in the store to 50. So the wait in the line can be sort of inconvenient, but it makes the shopping experience a lot less like crazed and feel safe. They're also passing out disinfected carts. So they have staff designated to do that, which feels good. Sprouts is doing the separating disinfected carts from non-cleaned carts, and they have good markings on the ground, but they're not limiting the number of people in store, and they don't have plexiglass up. Yeah, the post office, at least in Goleta, was a sad experience because they only have one full-time employee right now who mans the desk. So the line was very long and not very safe, and not everyone was wearing masks, and I was like very concerned for her and her well-being.
Isn't Trader Joe's organizing right now for a union, Rachel?
Yeah, they are. I mean, that I think has been one of the most exciting. I mean, it's heart-wrenching because like we understand why they you know, there's been so much anti-union push against them organizing, and especially during this time, you know, a lot of these companies have been extraordinarily pushy in terms of saying, oh, you know, the union is using this as a hoax to to get folks to organize. But the organizing has been incredibly organic. It's been from the grassroots. It has not been UFCW, you know, sending in people to get people riled up. People are really lifting each other up and standing collectively together, based on exactly what's happening. I will say too, if folks have been following what's happened with Instacart, food delivery drivers, grocery delivery drivers, there was an incredible national strike that happened right at the start of the pandemic. So we're really seeing workers connecting and standing up in a major way during this time.
Awesome. I'll just ask a question for our panelists. And I think related to, this conversation, I think one thing that stuck out for me that Julia kind of presented was about one of the, discussion points around how do we talk about workers, and how I think one of the contrasts that you showed was heroes versus victims. And so I'm curious, like, if folks would speak to that a little bit, our panelists, and to kind of think about, like, okay, there seems to be like a little bit of a dichotomy here where it's like superhero versus victim. And so I'm hoping you could speak a little bit more to like kind of the agency and autonomy associated with how we kind of think about this kind of framing of things. And just what's kind of your reaction to this kind of victim versus superhero kind of discourse that we're seeing?
So I don't really have, I don't really have like a hard stance on it, but there is a story, I think it was in Pennsylvania maybe, where the factory workers were there for like 2 months nonstop, living there and sleeping to not infect their families. They were making protective gear. And that was just an example of this kind of thing where I didn't know how to cut it, because a lot of them expressed a lot of pride in being able to do that and serve their community in that way. But it's also such like a sort of grim kind of circumstance. That was just another, I guess, related to Jeff's question of sort of not being able to work through all that.
I think there's a way to talk about this where, because this is the thing, capitalism, the way it decides like who gets high pay and who doesn't is very freaking arbitrary, right? And so like growing up, my mom worked 3 jobs, woke up at 5 in the morning, sometimes 4 in the morning, to cook her 5 kids breakfast, lunch, and dinner so she could go to work, her first job, go to her next job, go to her other job without having to worry if her kids were paid. I see my mother as a superhero, yet at the very same time, and she was a grocery store worker, by the way, that was one of her jobs. At the same time, the conditions in her workplaces were not, and even with her being unionized, were still not what they should have been, right? So there's a way to talk about the people as heroes while talking about the way the system victimizes people. I think that's the way we split it up. because I don't see my mom as a victim. I see her as a superhero, but I do blame capitalism for the shit that my family had to go through because she had to have 3 jobs, you know? So that's the way I see it.
Yeah, one of the things that stood out to me about that is that it's framed as either or. Like, why can't they be heroes and victims? And I think also the positionality of who's saying it really matters, because you could have, like, for instance, one of my group members was saying that Whole Foods responded to the death of some of their workers by just giving everyone a t-shirt saying heroes on it. And that's a very different type of calling people heroes than like neighbors clapping for healthcare workers returning home. And I think the second type has something potentially helpful in it, which is that people are recognizing how much goes into these jobs and celebrating that. And that could be the beginning of getting more support for them.
Right, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, for these comments. I think this really helps me think about what I think about it. I mean, I think we really need to exactly like think about the work that the label hero or victim does, and whether or not it creates opportunities for creates or destroys opportunities for agency. Fundamentally, it's the problem here is not about the work that's being done. It's whether or not you get to decide the conditions of your work. There are people who are voluntarily handing out food and food not bombs to houseless people, and and coming into like quite close contact with a population that is that has tremendous issues with comorbidity and that sort of thing. And these people are doing frontline work, but they are agents who are able to decide that. And they're not going to not be able to pay rent next month if they decide to, it's not like they are bound to that task. And by putting workers in the position of being agents over the conditions of their labor, that's how we actually make change, not just in COVID, but with the rest of our movements.
I also get worried about the discourse of heroes used by these like multinational corporations as disposability politics, right? Like what that Whole Foods t-shirt comment says to me is like going into the trope of like heroes being the ones who like die and are removed from life in order for them to go on in memory. So it's so like me seeing all these ads all over the place about heroes from these like, yeah, and Julia, it is militarizing in this like discourse of like rather than spending money to actually help these people and their well-being, it's like let's fall into this media discourse of valorizing people and spending so much money on ads without actually like giving back. So that's what I see, and similar to other people, like it is a troubling dichotomy. I think we need to get beyond at some point.
I also think that the ads focusing on superheroes are also, and this is maybe an obvious point, but what they do is they further that corporation's brand, and it has nothing to do about the individuals, their agency, their living conditions, the material conditions they labor in, and has everything to do with the fact that if Amazon puts an ad out that calls an Amazon worker a hero and they get to brand it, then Amazon is calling itself a hero. So I feel like part of the hypocrisy coming from this is, not that really it just does the brand, it furthers the brand without actually changing any of the laborers' laboring or living conditions.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate this conversation. And just to add to that, I mean, when we started advocating for higher wage, we were calling it hazard pay. And they said, and then the companies came back and said, no, it's heroes pay, So, it's absolutely, as folks have said, it's absolutely who's using the term and how they're using it. That matters deeply. And I've pushed back and said, we need to publicly call this hazard pay. But every single time you see an ad, it comes back as heroes pay.
maybe a follow-up question, a bit of pivot, and people feel free to ask other questions so I don't take up too much space. But I think I'd be curious to see like how people would kind of connect some of these conversations with some of the climate change, the common discussions that we have around climate change, around exposure, hazard, etc. So how would you all like kind of do that issue connection? I think that might be important for us to like sit on for a little bit, just so that we can all mull over that. Like, how do we make this compelling messaging around workers, agency, labor, hazard, and the environment and climate change?
I think there's a parallel connection to the way in which like the Enviro kind of establishment will recognize frontline communities and designate like a hero award. I'm thinking of like Berta Caceres. She received like the Goldman Prize, it was like hero. And yet when it comes to real support on the ground, I mean, this woman lost her life and was ultimately killed. So I think that it kind of reminds me of that, seeing them as heroes and then being taken out by that same system that will applaud itself on its sustainability metrics.
I was just reminded of the not apropos of anything particularly, but the anyone else read the David Graeber piece on superheroes? It's a fantastic essay, but it's about Batman, and it's kind of basically saying that like that the superheroes, not in the grocery store context, but in the Batman kind of context, are inherently reactionary figures, because they Batman has all the money in the world, and what does he do with it? He doesn't rebuild Gotham. He doesn't give everyone affordable housing. He doesn't do universal basic income. He like beats up like people with like mental disabilities and like and small town criminals. It's about like addressing problems in like a reactionary way rather than actually world changing. So I mean, I think that's maybe another way to kind of pivot the discourse on superheroes, or just get rid of superheroes entirely and just say agents.
This is kind of half-baked as a thought, but thinking about like the sort of moment, as someone said, that COVID, I forgot, something about like unveiling or revealing kind of systems that were already in place that we hadn't criticized, and the way that this has sort of spurred so much worker activism and like collection and organizing. I think the like workers' response to COVID is like almost a useful model for how to think about our own political engagement in environmentalism and environmental activism, because like even thinking about the meme that Julia showed about the pollution is less and we have less cars or whatever, and how much that the pollution in our environment is pinned on individuals' actions and not on corporate pollution, which is like the major source of like air pollution. I just think that like we kind of have workers are in this moment realizing the ways in which they were socially distanced before COVID and not having collective representation. In a way, I think we need to push ourselves and can push ourselves to think about ourselves united, not as individuals deciding whether or not to use like plastic straws or drive to work, but as people who are implicated in systems and at the kind of behest of systems that are doing damage that ends up getting blamed on our Starbucks purchases. I don't know, something sounded better. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Great. I think I'm really liking where this conversation is going. And I think like I wanted to maybe touch on something that was in the title. So creating communities of care. And so maybe we can focus on this care aspect a little bit. And so we'll focus on that and maybe bring it a little bit more concrete after we have this discussion. But like in terms of like how we're thinking about, care and how do we care for other people? And I think this relates to some of what you spoke to, Thomas, and others in terms of like individuals versus structures. And so I think like a lot of the kind of discourses that we might have been seeing have been around individuals can do a lot to save each other or to take care of each other. And so I think it's an interesting kind of contrast, or maybe contrast to how we think about climate change and like how do we think about how to mitigate climate change in terms of like well, should there be this focus on individual or collective care? Like what exactly are we dealing with in terms of our, thinking behind care? In the sense, like, are we caring for our families, or what's the kind of unit of care who are we caring for? I guess is maybe one way to think about that. Who are we caring for? What are we caring for? Like, are we caring for, outside of humans, the environment? Like, what is kind of our logics of care that we're kind of grappling with right now? And folks like who are not panelists, feel free to join Stack and say like, I want to speak to this, or yeah.
I think this maybe relates to discourses of self-care that have been criticized as like, yeah, we don't really need to do more self-care. We need to have reasonable jobs that don't leave us ragged all the time and exhausted. And we need to not be expected to take care of everyone if we're women, for instance. So yeah, I think like there's maybe kind of a parallel to the heroes discourse. Like it's kind of a corporate narrative about if you aren't feeling good, it's your fault for not taking more bubble baths and buying more self-care products,
I feel like my answer to this might kind of be a little lame at first, but I think that when I think about like who are capable of caring for, it's certainly like it's certainly dependent on people who are like who are most clearly in need. So a lot of the solidarity work that the mutual aid work that my affinity groups have been doing is about houselessness, whether that's trying to secure them access to sanitation materials, or whether that's distributing food, that sort of thing. I think it's also who are most capable of caring for. And that's simply just a practical kind of notion, particularly with affinity group organizing. Like you're going to be helping people who are in your community, who are really local to you. And to me, that doesn't mean that the caring stops at that very local level. To me, what it means is that we get in the habit of caring. And when we get in the habit of caring and we get better at it, we can reach out to other groups and we can network across broader spaces, while at the same time not being being subsumed by kind of forces that are much bigger than us and that we can't, or groups that are much bigger than us and that we don't have any real actual input in. So kind of keeping the center local, but making sure that different centers can connect. And again, emphasizing like getting in the habit of caring. It's because we all go to meetings every week that we can get together and talk and share ideas here.
Sage is next on Stack.
Yeah, this is also sort of half-baked, so I'm sorry if it doesn't come out very clear, but one of the things that I think about a lot in my own research as a graduate student, and also in my own political commitments, is the ways that Western thinking sets up the dichotomy between humanity and nature, or culture and nature. And so much of caring for me is thinking about the co-constituting and entangled relationship between my body and myself and my identity and the environments that I find myself in. And I've been thinking a lot about that with COVID, and I really, really appreciated Julia's presentation, and in part because I've been seeing a lot of that ecofascism too, and it makes me so deeply uncomfortable and it's so misguided. But I think a lot of it comes from the fact that we don't think of ourselves as enmeshed in the larger environment. So the virus sets us, catches us by surprise. And I've been thinking a lot about the ways folks have been going, running more, or beaches have had to be closed down because now that we can't go other places, we go outside. And I just feel part of caring for me is imagining myself as one life form in a larger multi-species network, and what that means and how one honors that. And I don't really have any real things to contribute, except for me that I always return to the like original environmental justice tenet that the environment is where we live, work, pray, and play. And I'm not religious, so pray doesn't really work for me, but maybe it's where we live, work, play, and like get COVID. And what does that mean? And like, what does it mean to be sick in places? I don't know. So I've been thinking a lot about the role of the environment in this, like in the kind of ideological paradigms we make for ourselves in the US. So I'm gonna stop talking, but I think CARE is related to that in some way.
So I have a kind of full-baked idea, but I'm not sure how it fits in, and it's kind of something I've just had on my soul for so long that I want to share in this space. But thinking about what Rye and Sage both have been saying about care and how we think about care and connection to others, there's this kind of debate that was mentioned earlier about like social distancing and physical distancing. And I was really curious if Julia has seen anything like this in your meme stuff. But like what struck me for a while, I was thinking about this a lot, was that social distancing, we frame it as like ourselves at the center and we are distanced socially from other people. Whereas I think another reading of that term would be that we are engaging the social act of distancing from one another as like an act of care and like respect and sort of wanting to maintain sort of community health. And I haven't seen any like memes or any like kind of online discourse to that effect, but I was like for a while a real like social distancing warrior. I was like, no, like it is social distancing because I'm like gonna be social and removed. But that there's a kind of different framework maybe for thinking about how we relate to others and care for others in our choices.
Awesome. Yeah, Julia, do you want to respond to that real quick, or?
Yeah, I don't know specifically about that. I've definitely been seeing people talking about social versus physical distancing and like together, apart, and that kind of stuff. And I think maybe, yeah, I wonder if certain like corporations might prefer social distancing in some ways because they're trying to quash all of this like solidarity that's happening.
Yeah, that was exactly my point.
Awesome. So maybe let's transition a little bit and think about like, well, what does solidarity look like? How can we move past some of the maybe symbolic gestures that we might have, like in terms of like solidarity of workers? And so I think maybe thinking back to some of the points that Rachel and Ana Rosa kind of raised, and thinking more concretely, what can we do? I think in the immediate kind of next few weeks and months. And I think so that's one kind of thread of questions that we can consider. And then two is like, well, how can we build some of this kind of movement infrastructure that will allow us to build up power, to, I think, demand more as the kind of pandemic kind of eases up.
I mean, one thing that I think is really important is recognizing that, I mean, as this crisis has clearly demonstrated, relying on people who are now in positions of power to do stuff for us doesn't work that well. And as much as we can ourselves in a horizontal fashion create alternative systems and create dual power, the better. So this involves supporting like when major supply lines get shut down. You can still go to the Ivy Food Co-op, and you can still support community supported agriculture and get a CSA. When personal protective equipment is not being distributed to workers, we can still make that stuff. When your housemates are become unemployed, you can collectivize resources and share rent money, and have like a communal pantry in your house. This is something that my housemates have been doing. I live with 7 other people. Half of us are not being paid right now, and half of us are able to work remotely. And we've been making more of an effort to do that kind of just within the house kind of mutual aid that has also served to make everyone in the house a lot closer. We hang out more. So those are some things that I think about as like real concrete solidarity.
Also, just speaking to what Rachel was mentioning earlier, Food and Water Action, as part of our volunteer activities, is going to be organizing social or physically distanced delegations to grocery stores as we see problems arising in grocery stores. So we can do that together apart if you want to participate in that too, so that we can let managers know that we're noticing, you know, lack of PPE, lack of physical distancing, lack of crowd control, lack of people being able to wash their hands, those kinds of things.
That's awesome. I was just going to add, and I can share with the group, Cal OSHA, as I mentioned earlier, has basically a checklist. So that can be enforced in any grocery store in all of California. And it's a great guideline to use. And all the things that folks have mentioned, it sounds like some of the stores have already incorporated that, which is fantastic. But it's helpful for, as community, we can look at it and sort of just walk in sort of with a guideline to literally to say to the manager of any store, hey, are these being enforced? And if they're not, what's the process to make them enforced? So, and I like the ideas of other folks of sort of bringing in PPE. That's something that is incredibly, it's a very supportive gesture. One thing we've been doing down here too is delivering meals, working with food pantries to deliver meals to folks who are in quarantine. And so that we know is something that is incredibly valuable as well.
I just want to add, like, I really hope that we move from this place of seeing like supply chains as this distant thing that are determined without our input, and that we start seeing them as lifelines or life-affirming networks. So I really do hope that folks become more familiar with them, become more involved. And in terms of like that aspect of care, like, yeah, I really think there's an immense opportunity for us to become more involved and connected.
Off of Jessica's point as well, I hope that we can see and continue to make visible folks who are considered essential workers. I know a lot of people today talked about the ways that a lot of those jobs have been invisibilized, or the kinds of low pay, long hours have been something that like hasn't been on the forefront of a lot of Americans' minds. And so I'm hoping that with these connections and with the way the pandemic has made folks' working conditions so apparent at every level, that this is something we continue to keep in mind and continue to organize around even when the pandemic ends.
I have another question, but like if people want to ask a point us in a different direction, please feel free to put yourself on stack. So I'll just wait a second. Okay, so I think like I was hoping maybe we could touch on one of Rye's point around the hyperlocal, and so like wanting to, I think about that like a little bit more. So like hyperlocal, like I really like what you were saying here, and since that like we take advantage of our local knowledge and have that be a source of like great organizing, you know, strategy and tactics. And so I'm curious, like if you and others could speak to like thinking about like how we kind of build from the hyperlocal and like kind of connect and have these different networks, and how we're able to share resources and strategy and et cetera. And so how do we, I think, do that work?
Yeah, so one thing that I'd like to say just right off is like, most of the things that the affinity groups that I'm part of have been working on are we have done in collaboration with other groups. So the first people that we reached out to with the prison solidarity stuff was Underground Scholars, which is a fantastic group that we've been in contact with for months. I think we started working with them about a year ago, as well as the Fair and Just Transition Network, as well as folks from DSA. These are relationships that we've been building for a very long time, and that we were able to, so as soon as we were like, we want to do something about prison solidarity, we had like 10 people who were like, oh, they're gonna want to get in on this, you know. And it's because we've all been organizing in town for a really long time, and we know a lot of people. Bonfire Collective has been around for since Occupy, and that gives us a really long history. It also, you know, our connections through Student Activist Network to folks like Andy Johnson, who linked us up with the Ivy Housing Crisis Network, that, you know, linked us up with somebody from USLAC who we worked with for as well. Like, and we were able to bring those folks into conversation with folks at county. You know, it's not like affinity groups, you know, start small and very local, but because we're all interested in doing a lot of different kinds of things, we meet people over the years, and that allows us to make these connections. It doesn't mean that we all have to be at the same meeting all the time in, you know, 50 or 100 person groups, but it means that we have a point person who we can go to all the time for just about any issue that we want to tackle.
I think those are all great points, right? In addition to everything that was mentioned, just want to point out, like, when we're organizing on issues, to make sure that we're checking to see who else is also organizing on the issue. For example, with the prison issue that I mentioned during my comments earlier, the NAACP North County is leading on that. So making sure that we stay plugged in to the work as we are expanding who else wants to be involved in it.
Right, absolutely, and because David was able to let me know that Anna Rosa was doing prison solidarity stuff, I was able to reach out to Anna Rosa, and Anna Rosa connected me to Simone, and Simone is who wrote the post that Pratik saw that inspired us to start doing the prison solidarity stuff, and he reached out to her immediately as well. You know, so this is just like how that's, you know, that spark of wanting to organize together, it enables us to also make sure that, I think maybe to your point, Anna Rosa, that we don't just like create like endless redundancy. Some amount of redundancy is really important when you're focusing on very specific local projects. Like, it makes sense to have a lot of people making masks. It makes sense to for a lot of people to be running groceries. But, you know, but does it make sense for everybody to try to start a a farmer's market? Like, no, then you've got competition, and that's not good, you know, in that particular context, you know. So making sure that we don't recruit, like being able to connect with other groups means that we don't end up just like reinventing the wheel every single time we want to do something. And it allows us to really honor the work that people have been working at for years to get good at.
It's based on the concept of cooperation, right? And just to put in a really super quick plug, because we're a small group of people, we don't want to let it get out too much, because we're just kind of starting it. But actually, Jess, Chelsea, Diane, and myself will be hosting a meeting on Wednesday from 7 to 9 p.m. Called Cooperation Santa Barbara. So kind of talking about how we can infuse cooperative economics into our community more, and help places like the Ivy Food Co-op and other places that are starting as co-ops really flourish and succeed.
Awesome, great, thank you all so much. I think, so we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm hoping that we can end by either verbally or in the chat box saying what we individually will commit to doing. Perhaps as a result of the conversation that we've had today. So would anyone like to say out loud what they'd be willing to commit to doing, or also in the chat box?
So the folks who are in the Affinity group that I'm working with, who are making masks, we've handed out a lot to houseless populations, and our next the next group that we want to start distributing to are frontline workers, and so folks at grocery stores, that sort of thing. So I'd be it might be useful to collaborate, Rachel, like with you know, figuring out like where are places what kinds of stores are people like really not wearing masks, or might not have access to masks, and using that information together. So if you see like a hotspot where it's like, holy shit, everything is really scary in here, like that might be the first place that we kind of go to.
I think for me, Thomas and I on Monday are talking about labor organizing, and a lot of the conversations people have had today and yesterday in our planning meeting and the resources that people shared, I definitely want to include in that, and it's given me a lot of like tangible things that people can do. A lot that we've been talking about each week has been really global or like kind of theoretical things with like past case studies, and I think this is a great moment to start switching to what we talked about, rather than being reactionary, to being like proactive and getting people moving forward. So I know that I'm going to take that away, and I really appreciate everyone's insights and care in this meeting.
I've been kind of under the weather recently, so I haven't been able to like go out and actually do any of the mutual aid stuff, which is frustrating. But I'd be very interested in making art or writing opinion pieces about some of these issues that we've discussed, with links to specific actions or to help publicize efforts that other people are involved in.
I'm sure that that you'd be looking to publish your pieces anywhere, Julia. But I'll link on the side to the WordPress that our group set up. I'm sure that we'd be super happy to incorporate like a blog or that kind of thing, and you'll own the rights to it and everything. And yeah, just kidding. So you can post elsewhere, but I'll post to WordPress.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, y'all. Let me post, so there's a feedback form that you can, it's a little Google form survey. So if you want to take a note of that and put it into your browser and give feedback to our, how it was facilitated, how the panelists were doing, and the kind of order, and like any feedback that you have, I think would be useful for other types of programming. Okay, so I think we're pretty good on time. So I think, like, does anyone want to make any closing comments, like any inspirational things that they want to say to close us off?
How about the slogan, care versus capitalism, from now on?
I like it. Okay, anyone else?
One way or another, we've all got to be wearing masks. I'll post the crime thing.
Great. Let's see. So I will start an email thread with all the emails that we have, like of the folks who are here, but also, of course, take down notes of the chat box if you want to do that. And so I'll be in touch shortly, and we can potentially see this as an initial conversation for what's to come. But thank you all so much. I really appreciated spending time with y'all.
Thank you. This was a great call. You're all really inspiring.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. This was amazing.
Happy Friday.
Thank you all.
Take care of
Happy
yourselves
Friday.
too, everybody.
Bye.